Daniel wasn't anyone special. At least, that's how most people saw him. He was quiet, kept to himself, and worked long hours, often blending into the background wherever he went. He preferred it that way, never drawing too much attention. Few people knew about his past or the values he held close to his heart. If you asked around, people would describe him as unremarkable, perhaps even a bit standoffish. But he didn't mind. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to go unnoticed. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when he noticed her, a woman standing on the side of the road with a broken-down car. Her expression was tense, her eyes darting from her phone to the deserted road around her. There was an unmistakable sense of unease in her posture, a look that spoke volumes about her discomfort. She seemed like the kind of person who wasn't used to being stranded alone in an unfamiliar area, especially not in a place like this. And while she appeared outwardly calm, her anxious glances and tight grip on her phone told a different story. It was clear she felt vulnerable. Daniel could have driven by, like most people would. After all, he didn't know this woman, and it wasn't his problem. But something about her caught his attention, tugging at his sense of compassion. Maybe it was the way she kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting something to go wrong at any moment, or perhaps it was the quiet desperation in her eyes. He hesitated, a small part of him wondering if he should just keep going. But then, he remembered the countless times he had been in need, hoping someone would stop to help. He knew what it felt like to be alone and uncertain. With a deep breath, Daniel pulled over, stepped out of his car, and approached her cautiously, not wanting to startle her. She noticed him right away, and there was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. She clutched her phone a little tighter, her eyes widening just a fraction, as she took in his appearance. He could tell she was wary, maybe even a bit frightened, but he understood why. The lone man approaching a stranded woman wasn't always a welcome sight, and Daniel was no stranger to the assumptions people often made about him. Still, he offered a friendly smile, hoping to ease her nerves. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he said, keeping his tone light and non-threatening. She hesitated, glancing from him to her car, clearly torn between accepting his help and maintaining her distance. Finally, after what seemed like a long pause, she gave a small nod, allowing him to take a look under the hood. As he worked, he could feel her watching him, still unsure whether to trust him, but gradually her shoulders seemed to relax. They exchanged a few words, just casual small talk, and he found himself surprised at how easily they fell into conversation. She laughed at one of his jokes, a soft, hesitant laugh that told him she was starting to feel a bit more comfortable. For a brief moment, Daniel thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a small connection with someone who didn't see him as a stranger or a threat. But as he fixed her car and waved her off with a friendly goodbye, he had no idea that this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events he never could have anticipated. Daniel approached her cautiously, extending an offer of help with a polite nod and a friendly smile, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes. She looked him over, and he could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind, sizing him up, deciding whether he was friend or foe. He wasn't surprised. He was used to this reaction, the flash of doubt, the guarded look that crept into people's faces whenever they first met him. He knew it was more about assumptions than reality, something he'd learned to accept over the years. But he didn't let her discomfort stop him. He simply kept his voice calm and reassuring, focusing on the car instead of her wary glances. Slowly, as he got to work, checking under the hood and making a few adjustments, he noticed her defenses beginning to soften. She seemed to relax bit by bit, as if realizing he wasn't a threat. She even started chatting with him, and he responded in kind, sharing a few light-hearted stories to ease the tension. He could see a small smile forming on her face as she laughed at one of his jokes. For a brief moment, they were just two people, sharing a conversation on the side of the road. And in that fleeting connection, Daniel felt the warmth of human kindness, the sense that maybe, despite their differences, they'd managed to bridge a gap. When he finally got her car running again, she thanked him, and he waved her off, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't every day he got to help someone in need, and it felt good to know he'd been there for her. But as he walked back to his own car, he couldn't shake a strange feeling. There was something about her parting glance, a fleeting look that seemed to carry a trace of lingering doubt, almost as if she hadn't completely let go of her initial suspicions. But he brushed it off, figuring it was just his imagination. The next day, however, his doorbell rang, jolting him out of his routine. He wasn't expecting anyone, so when he opened the door to find two stern-faced police officers standing on his doorstep, his heart skipped a beat. They introduced themselves, their gazes intense as they regarded him with a mixture of scrutiny and suspicion. Before he could ask what this was about, they told him that someone had filed a complaint. Confused, he listened as they described an accusation of unwanted contact and suspicious behavior. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what they were saying. Then it hit him. The woman he had helped yesterday. She was the one who'd filed the complaint. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he struggled to understand why she would do something like this. He had been nothing but kind, offering his time and effort to help her when she was in need. They'd even laughed together, hadn't they? For a moment, they'd connected, or so he had thought. Yet here he was, standing in his own doorway, facing accusations as if he were a criminal. The officers questioned him about his interaction with her, pressing for details he could barely recall, every word laced with doubt. As he answered, replaying the encounter in his mind, he felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. It seemed so absurd. He had only tried to help. But now he was under scrutiny, all because of a misunderstanding he couldn't even begin to unravel. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at him. Why would she do this? He replayed the events of the previous day, scrutinizing every word he'd said, every gesture he'd made, searching for something that could explain her reaction. Had he come across as too eager or too friendly? Had he somehow made her feel uncomfortable without realizing it? But each time he went over the scene in his mind, he reached the same conclusion. He had done nothing but help her, offering assistance out of kindness, nothing more. Yet here he was, facing accusations and judgment from people who hadn't been there, who didn't know him. It stung, the assumption that he was guilty simply because of how he looked or the quiet life he led. And as the days passed, whispers began to spread. He felt the weight of suspicious glances from neighbors, saw the way people avoided eye contact when he walked down the street. He was no longer just Daniel. He had become that man, the one who'd been accused. Finally, as he dug deeper, speaking with a friend who had connections in town, he uncovered the truth. It wasn't about something he'd done. It was about something she'd assumed. She hadn't filed the complaint because he'd acted inappropriately or crossed a line. She'd done it because of how he looked, the stereotypes she held onto without question. She'd seen a man who didn't fit into her world, who didn't dress, speak, or move like the people she trusted. In her eyes, he was an outsider, someone who, by his very presence, was suspect. The revelation cut him deeply. He'd faced prejudice before, moments of mistrust and judgment, but never like this. Never had he been painted as a criminal for merely existing, for stepping out of his comfort zone to help another human being. It was a bitter pill to swallow, the idea that his kindness could be twisted into something sinister simply because of someone else's fears and assumptions. Daniel couldn't help but feel trapped by the invisible boundaries others placed around him, by the labels they used to define him without ever knowing who he truly was. As days turned into weeks, Daniel struggled with the weight of this knowledge. He went about his daily routine with a sense of unease, his guard now up, his steps a little more cautious. He found himself shrinking back from people, no longer willing to risk a friendly gesture or a simple smile. The betrayal had marked him in ways he hadn't anticipated, making him question whether it was worth reaching out to others, if this was the price he'd pay. The sting of injustice burned in his chest, leaving him wondering how many others had felt this same sting, had been misunderstood, and misjudged simply because they didn't fit the mold. The more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't just his story. It was a story that many, like him, carried silently. Determined to clear his name, Daniel took a step he'd never imagined he would need to take. It wasn't easy for him to push back against the injustice, but he knew he had to defend his dignity and his integrity. Over the following days, he worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence he could find to support his case. He meticulously combed through his phone, finding the texts and photos he had exchanged with friends that day, detailing the events as they unfolded in real time. The records showed his thoughts and intentions, proof that he had done nothing inappropriate, that his only motive had been to help someone in need. Daniel reached out to the people who had seen him that day, friends, and even a couple of strangers who'd driven by and seen him assisting the woman by the roadside. Each witness was willing to vouch for his character, describing him as respectful, kind, and genuine. They spoke of how they'd never seen him lose his temper or speak out of turn, no matter how others had treated him in the past. Even though he was nervous, knowing how easily things could be twisted, the support he received gave him courage. When he finally met with a lawyer, Daniel poured out his frustrations and hurt, detailing how this unfounded accusation had affected his life. The lawyer, a seasoned man with years of experience, listened carefully and nodded with understanding. He could see that Daniel wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting against a stereotype that too many people had faced. They spent hours going over every detail, refining his statement, making sure they were prepared to face any curveballs in court. His lawyer reassured him that the truth was on his side, and if he remained calm and composed, the facts would speak for themselves. As the court date approached, Daniel felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that people were whispering about him, wondering if the rumors were true. The weight of those assumptions was heavy, but he steeled himself, knowing that this was his chance to show everyone who he really was. Finally, the day arrived. Daniel dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that felt dignified and professional, ones that reflected the person he wanted them to see, not a caricature, not a stereotype, but himself with nothing to hide. Walking into the courtroom, he felt 100 eyes on him, each gaze a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and, from some, quiet support. He knew that this was a moment he would remember for the rest of his life, no matter the outcome. When he entered the courtroom, his heart nearly skipped a beat as he saw her, the woman he had helped that day. She sat stiffly, eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way to escape. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else there, a flicker of nervousness, perhaps even regret. She hadn't expected him to fight back. He could see it in her face, in the way she avoided his gaze. In that moment, Daniel felt a surge of strength. He wasn't here to intimidate or belittle her, but to set the record straight. As the proceedings began, the judge asked him to take the stand. His hands were steady as he held onto the evidence he'd gathered, his voice calm and clear as he recounted each step of their interaction. He started from the very beginning, describing how he'd seen her stranded on the side of the road and had felt compelled to help. He detailed every action he took, every word they exchanged, his account unwavering. There was no malice, no hidden motive, just a man doing what he thought was right. As he spoke, he noticed the woman shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Each statement he made, each piece of evidence he presented seemed to chip away at the narrative she'd built. He could feel the tension in the room, the quiet murmurs as people began to question what they'd been told. His lawyer presented the text messages he had exchanged with friends, time-stamped and showing his innocent intentions. Each message revealed his state of mind, his confusion about her guarded behavior, and his genuine concern for her safety. Then came the witnesses, one by one, people who had known him for years and could attest to his character. They spoke of how Daniel was a person who kept to himself, who had never caused trouble or raised his voice in anger. One of them, an old friend, described a time when Daniel had gone out of his way to help a neighbor fix her fence after a storm, asking for nothing in return. Their words painted a picture of a man who was reliable, considerate, and undeserving of the accusations he now faced. Finally, it was the woman's turn to speak. She rose slowly, her gaze darting from the judge to Daniel and then to the floor, as if searching for the right words. She described her experience, focusing on how she had felt vulnerable, alone, and frightened on the side of the road. She admitted that she had been afraid, that his approach had caught her off guard. But as she spoke, her story began to unravel. The prosecutor questioned her about the specifics of her fear. Had he said anything threatening? Had he done anything to make her feel unsafe? With each question, her responses grew shorter, her confidence wavering. She couldn't point to any words or actions of his that had been inappropriate or threatening. Her face flushed with shame as she realized that her accusations were rooted in her own assumptions, not in anything Daniel had done. The judge listened intently, his expression serious but fair, as her testimony slowly crumbled under the weight of the truth. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge looked between Daniel and the woman, considering the facts before him. In that charged silence, it felt as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for justice to be served. And then, the judge finally spoke, his words clear and firm. He declared that the evidence overwhelmingly supported Daniel's innocence, dismissing the case with a stern reminder to the woman that accusations should not be based on unfounded fears or biases. As the decision was announced, Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had come through this trial with his integrity intact, his head held high. The woman looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and shame. She mumbled a quiet apology, but Daniel only nodded, a sense of closure settling over him. He didn't need her words to know he had done the right thing. In the end, he had proven not only his innocence but the strength of his character. As he left the courtroom, friends and supporters who had come to stand by him gathered around, congratulating him on his victory. He felt lighter, freer, knowing that he had cleared his name and defended his dignity. The whispers and assumptions he'd endured would fade in time, but this moment would stay with him as a reminder of his resilience. He had faced down prejudice and come out the other side, knowing who he was and what he stood for, and in that victory, he found a quiet strength he hadn't known he possessed. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision. After reviewing the evidence, hearing the witnesses, and observing the woman's increasingly hesitant testimony, the verdict was clear. The complaint was dismissed, and with that simple act, the weight that had burdened Daniel for weeks began to lift. He stood up, shoulders back, head held high, feeling a profound sense of relief and vindication. This experience had taken so much from him, his peace of mind, his sense of security in his own community. Yet in the end, he'd reclaimed what mattered most, his integrity and the truth. As Daniel turned to leave the courtroom, he caught a glimpse of the woman who had accused him. She was sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face downcast and flushed with shame. It was clear that she hadn't expected this outcome, perhaps even that she hadn't expected her own assumptions to unravel so publicly. The regret was visible in her expression, an unspoken acknowledgement that her fears had led her astray, causing more harm than she could have anticipated. Daniel felt a mixture of emotions. There was anger, yes, but it was tempered by something else. Pity, perhaps for someone who had lived so fully within the walls of her own biases that she had feared a helping hand. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. People from his neighborhood, coworkers, even a few strangers who had heard his story and wanted to show their support. Some had been on his side from the beginning, while others had doubted, caught up in the whispers and rumors. But as Daniel emerged, walking out into the bright afternoon light with a quiet strength, he could feel the shift in their gaze. He was no longer just another face in the crowd. He was someone they could look to with admiration, someone they respected for having faced down an unjust accusation with dignity and resilience. One by one, people approached him, offering words of support, shaking his hand, even apologizing for having doubted him. Some shared their own stories of facing prejudice or judgment, of knowing what it felt like to be misjudged. These words of solidarity, spoken softly and sincerely, reminded him that he wasn't alone. There were others who understood the toll of assumptions, who knew the quiet strength it took to stand up for oneself in the face of judgment. It was a bittersweet comfort, knowing that his story had resonated with so many, but it also filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. In the days that followed, Daniel noticed subtle changes in his interactions with others. The neighbors who had once looked away when passing him on the street now greeted him warmly, nodding with respect. At work, colleagues who had previously kept their distance began to engage him in conversations, not out of pity, but out of genuine interest. Some asked how he was doing, while others offered their apologies for not having stood up for him sooner. It was strange, surreal even, to see the way people's perceptions of him had transformed almost overnight. The same individuals who had once been quick to believe a baseless accusation were now eager to show their support. But for Daniel, the most meaningful change was within himself. This ordeal had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to confront the impact of prejudice and the strength it took to stand firm in the truth. He realized that he had come through it not just for himself, but for others who had faced similar situations in silence. He had seen firsthand the power of assumptions and how they could tear down a person's reputation without a shred of evidence. And while he had won his battle, he knew there were countless others who might not have the means, the support, or the resilience to do the same. Gradually, Daniel began speaking out about his experience, sharing his story with local organizations and community groups. He visited schools, libraries, and town halls, using his story as a means to foster awareness and empathy. He wanted people to understand that prejudice could wear many faces, that it could hide behind polite smiles, casual conversations, or even well-meaning concerns. By sharing his story, he hoped to encourage others to examine their own biases, to recognize the damage that assumptions could cause, and to inspire them to approach others with empathy and understanding. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. His talks resonated with people from all walks of life, each person finding a piece of their own experience in his words. Daniel became a respected figure, not just because of what he had gone through, but because of what he had chosen to do with it. He turned his pain into a message of hope and unity, encouraging others to look beyond appearances and to question their own judgments. His story became a reminder that justice wasn't only served in courtrooms, it was also upheld in the choices people made every day to treat each other with kindness and respect. One evening, months after the court case had ended, Daniel was walking home when he heard a familiar voice call out to him. He turned to see the woman who had accused him standing there, looking as though she had been waiting for this moment. She approached him slowly, her eyes filled with remorse. She stammered through an apology, her words halting and unsure. She explained that she had acted out of fear, out of ignorance, and that she deeply regretted the pain she had caused him. Daniel listened quietly, taking in her words, his expression calm but unreadable. When she finished, there was a long pause. Daniel could see the sincerity in her eyes, the weight of her guilt, and though he still felt the sting of her betrayal, he knew that holding on to anger would only hurt him in the end. So he nodded, accepting her apology with a quiet dignity that surprised even himself. He didn't offer her forgiveness right away, but he let her know that he appreciated her honesty and her willingness to acknowledge her mistake. As she walked away, he felt a sense of closure settle over him, a peaceful resolve that allowed him to finally put the experience behind him. From that day on, Daniel continued his work within the community, quietly making a difference with each conversation, each story he shared. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, but he was willing to be part of the journey, to plant the seeds of empathy and understanding wherever he went. And in the eyes of those who knew him, he was no longer just a man who had been falsely accused. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that true strength came not from proving others wrong, but from standing firm in one's truth, regardless of the obstacles. His journey had taken him through darkness, but he emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than ever before. And though his story had begun with an unfair judgment, it had ended with a community coming together, united by a newfound respect for the man they had once overlooked. In the end, justice had been served, not just for Daniel, but for everyone who chose to see him for who he truly was. As Daniel moved forward, he carried with him a quiet, hard-won truth. Sometimes, people fear what they don't understand, and their fear can easily turn into judgment, transforming a simple misunderstanding into something far more damaging. Yet, he also realized that in those dark moments, when prejudice or ignorance loomed largest, there was an opportunity to stand up, not only for himself, but for all those who had been misjudged, those who had silently suffered from the weight of others' assumptions. By speaking his truth and defending his character, he'd shown his community the strength that could emerge from vulnerability. The journey hadn't been easy. There were moments when he'd felt alone, moments when he questioned if it was worth the struggle. But in the end, he knew his resilience had resonated with others. Each day, he saw subtle changes in the people around him, in the way they carried themselves, in the openness with which they now approached him. His story had become a catalyst for reflection, a reminder that everyone held biases, even if they weren't aware of them, and that overcoming those biases began with a willingness to look beyond the surface. Daniel found that sharing his experience didn't just help others, it helped him heal too. As he spoke about his journey through prejudice, he discovered a newfound sense of peace. His story, once a source of pain, had transformed into a narrative of empowerment, a testament to the strength that lay within him. And with every conversation, every person who came to him with their own stories of struggle and resilience, he felt his purpose deepen. He realized that his experience, though deeply personal, was part of a much larger tapestry, a collective struggle shared by many, woven from countless lives touched by bias, misunderstanding, and judgment. As he continued his outreach, Daniel came to appreciate the power of small, consistent actions. He visited local schools and community centers, speaking to young people about the importance of empathy and open-mindedness. He shared his story in classrooms, encouraging students to ask questions, to challenge their assumptions, and to consider the impact of their words and actions on others. Daniel could see the curiosity in their faces, the way they listened intently, reflecting on his words. He wanted them to understand that true courage wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about staying true to oneself, even when others doubted or misjudged you. His message was simple but profound. We're all connected, and the way we see each other matters. Don't let fear or assumptions get in the way of understanding. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt talk, a young boy approached him, his eyes bright with admiration. "I want to be like you, Mr. Daniel," he said, clutching his notebook tightly. "I want to be brave enough to stand up when things aren't fair." Daniel felt a warmth spread through him as he smiled at the boy, knowing that these moments, small as they seemed, were where real change began. It was in these seeds of understanding and courage planted in the hearts of the next generation that he found hope for a more compassionate world. Daniel's story reached beyond his community, eventually drawing attention from local media. He was invited to share his journey on a broader platform, where he spoke openly about the importance of confronting prejudice with patience and persistence. His words echoed across the airwaves, reaching people he would never meet, but whose lives he touched nonetheless. Letters and emails began to pour in from strangers who had seen his story, each one a testament to how deeply his message had resonated. Some shared their own battles against unfair assumptions. Others simply thanked him for his courage, for being a voice for those who had long remained silent. With time, Daniel's perspective continued to evolve. He realized that his journey had given him a rare gift, the ability to see beyond people's masks, to recognize the humanity hidden beneath the layers of fear, pride, and insecurity that often clouded people's judgments. He knew now that everyone carried their own burdens, their own fears of being misunderstood or unseen. And so, instead of harboring resentment, he chose to approach others with empathy, even those who had doubted or judged him. By doing so, he found that he could transform the very cycle of bias that had once hurt him. He reflected on the journey, on the countless people who had supported him, and even on those who had doubted him. Each person, in their own way, had contributed to his growth, shaping him into a person who now moved through life with a quiet, unwavering confidence. Daniel understood that his story was no longer just about clearing his name. It had become a story about resilience, about breaking down barriers, and about inspiring others to confront their own biases. He had become a living testament to the power of patience, courage, and self-respect. In quieter moments, Daniel would often think back to that pivotal day on the roadside, to the woman he had helped, and the chain of events that had unfolded from that single act of kindness. He no longer held anger toward her. Instead, he saw her as a catalyst, a person whose fear had sparked his own transformation. She had given him the opportunity to become someone he could be proud of, someone who could look in the mirror and know he'd stood up for himself with grace. And for that, he felt a strange sense of gratitude. One evening, as he watched a sunset casting warm colors across the sky, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He realized that his story, though born from pain, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. It had not only changed the way his community saw him, but it had also reshaped the way they saw each other, inviting them to think twice before casting judgments or making assumptions. His story had taught them the value of empathy and the courage it took to look beyond appearances. Reflecting on all that had happened, Daniel held on to one powerful truth. The world is full of assumptions, but courage can cut through them all. He knew that each of us had the power to be that light in someone's darkness, to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. And sometimes, standing up for oneself wasn't just about personal justice. It was about teaching others a lesson they'd never forget. Daniel had learned that courage didn't always look like grand gestures or defiant speeches. Sometimes it was the quiet strength to keep going, to speak the truth, to hold one's ground, and to choose understanding over resentment. His journey had reminded him that no one was immune to fear or bias, but everyone had the potential to rise above it, to choose a path of empathy and kindness. And he knew that by continuing to share his story, by living with integrity, he would keep inspiring others to do the same. In the end, Daniel's legacy wasn't just a story of a man who had been wronged and found justice. It was a story about the power of self-respect, of resilience, and of the quiet yet transformative force of compassion. As he walked forward, he carried this lesson with him, a reminder that sometimes it takes just one person standing up to make the world a little more just, a little more understanding, and a little more brave.